You've been hearing us talk about imperial yeast for a while now, and that's because we absolutely love this stuff. With 200 billion cells in each pitch-right pouch, we rarely even need to make starters these days. Unfortunately, not everybody has the access to imperial yeast those of us out here on the West Coast do, because they're based out of Portland, Oregon. But things are about to change. Imperial Yeast is excited to announce the opening of their East Coast location, which is huge for those who want the freshest yeast possible with the best pitch rates, but brew on the other side of the country. They're going to start by offering their four most popular strains, A38 Juice, A07 Flagship, L13 Global, and GO3 Dieter, with the goal of providing their full lineup of yeast by mid-2021. So start your planning now at imperialyeast.com. Over the last few years, a lot of brewers have become very concerned with the impact oxygen exposure on the cold side once the beer is finished fermenting has, present company absolutely included. Well, a similar level of concern used to be placed on the impact aeration has during the lauter and boil steps. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to chat about hot side aeration is contributor Cade Jobe.
Oh yeah, the hot side aeration. Is it a myth? Is it something that we should focus on? How much does it impact your brewing? What is oxygen and oxidation? Oh man, there's so much that we can talk about in this episode, but I'm surprised that we haven't gotten to this one yet in the podcast.
Yeah, God, I'm surprised too. This was such a common topic back in the day when I made the switch from extract to all grain brewing. And, back then it really did seem like hot side aeration was talked about in brewing circles far more often than it comes up today. Though there was a growing subset of folks who viewed the whole HSA thing as, like you mentioned, a myth. That term got thrown around quite a bit in regards to hot side aeration back then. We're going to be going into all of that, as well as the results of an experiment that I completed on this topic in this episode. All right, if you like what we're up to and you want us to keep doing it, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy. By committing to a small monthly pledge over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Coming up later this month, January of 2021, is somebody who has had an undeniable impact on the homebrewing world through her work at the Homebrew Talk Forum, Lorena Evans, whose experience with both forum moderation and brewing are vast. Given her deep knowledge of beer and brewing, I'm sure this is going to be a fantastic session. To be a part of it, you have to make your pledge at patreon.com/Brewlosophy by January 22nd, 2021. All past sessions are stored on our private Facebook page, so patrons can go back whenever they want and watch them. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and a review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we would really appreciate it. It helps people who may not have heard of us yet to find the show. Feedback is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who specialize in triclover compatible sanitary fittings, conical fermenters, kettles, and brew stands. Brewers Hardware offers a variety of unique items for home and craft brewers, including high-quality stainless fittings at great prices with super fast shipping. Learn more at brewershardware.com, and don't forget to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. That's brewershardware.com. Michael Blankenship had some feedback on our recent episode where we talked about steeping roasted grains in wort. He said, because you showed it likely doesn't make a perceptible difference, when I plan a brew with roasted grains, I'll enter the whole mash bill into brew and water, adjust my ion profile, then check the pH calculation. If it's below 5.2, I just go back and reduce the roasted grains, darkest first, until the mash pH is where I want it. And then I just steep whatever I remove from the mash in the wort. No acid or base additions required. This seems like a pretty damn smart idea for those who are concerned about mash pH but don't want to mess around with actual acid additions. Maybe I'm missing something, but hey, if it works, I guess, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's really interesting. Yeah, using your, dialing back your roasted grains additions over there. Wow. Yeah, I might have to try that whenever I brew my next darker beer that's using roasted grains.
I mean, it's really not that much different than using acidulated malt, though acidulated malt you add to adjust your mash pH because of the lactic acid that's on that malt, whereas with roasted grains you're just relying on the acidity caused by the roasting process. I think it's a pretty clever idea. I can't think of any potential downsides to doing that, particularly given that experiment that Michael is talking about, the one we were talking about in a prior episode, that it did show that people couldn't taste a difference between a beer that was made with the roasted grains in the mash versus one where it was steeped. My thing is that I just can't seem to taste a difference, and neither can tasters, it appears, between beers that are mashed with a lower pH and those mashed with either a normal or even a higher pH. So I'm just not terribly concerned about it anyways, but this seems like a really easy option.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, especially if you're in a dark beer, right? I mean, a really easy way to do it is just adjusting that roasted grain profile, right?
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people are having to add baking soda because they're adding too many roasted grains, to raise the pH. But, yeah, I mean, I think that's it's a way that I hadn't thought about it before, I guess, right? It's not all that surprising whenever you think about it and think about how it works, but it's when you put things in a new context that's meaningful. And this is definitely a new context for me.
Yeah. I appreciate the idea, Michael, and it's ideas like this that make me love homebrewing so much. There's just a lot of really, I would say, ingenious thinking out there that, and I'm constantly learning new things from the people who are writing into us based on the stuff that we already talked about. And yeah, this is a cool idea. So again, appreciate the feedback, Michael. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. I love coffee, and obviously I love beer, but I'm really not the biggest fan of beers made with coffee. I've had a few that I enjoy, but for the most part, I'm beer-flavored beer guy. Well, listener Brian Summers sent me a cream ale he made with both coffee and vanilla beans. He calls it Jump, Jive, and Whale, and I shared it with my friends to see what they thought.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim. Always have to like the beer. In fact, sometimes that's not right to do.
Ooh, it smells like weed.
You can't serve me beers with weed in them, Mark, so I'm in the military. Don't play tricks like that on me. Those aren't funny.
Oh, it's roasty.
It is roasty. I like it already. I like it a lot. You don't like it, do you?
I said,
It is roasty. Oh, what a great word.
Yeah.
We sound like learned men. I like it, dude.
Got like a little spice, too.
Spice.
Yeah.
Like fake weed spice? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
It's like I don't know. You don't get that right at the end? After the roast? Oh, it's good.
I like it too. I have no idea what it is. It's beer.
It is a beer.
No, that's really good. That's right. I would drink more of these.
Yeah.
Oh, it's gone.
I'm going to say, I'll go 7.
I would give that a 10.
A 10, damn.
10.
All right.
The thing I hate about most coffee beers is when it imparts a noticeable green pepper flavor. It's not something I get in every coffee beer, but I've had many with what I believe is this nasty characteristic. I am happy to report that I detected no green pepper in Brian's Jump, Jive, and Whale. The coffee flavor was rather assertive, but not in a bad way. It was just real coffee-like. And the vanilla was faint enough so as not to be annoying, but it was there to add almost like a cream texture or that kind of coffee and cream flavor. I don't think, I'm just being real here, I don't think I would order a pint after pint of this beer, but it was certainly good enough for me to finish the entire sample I poured myself. I'm not sure what Tim was talking about, the whole spicy comment, but perhaps he was picking up something my palate just missed.
Wow, yeah. First of all, that name, Jump, Jive, and Whale, is a fantastic name for that beer. I love that song, Jump, Jive, and Whale. I was a trombone player in high school and college, and that was definitely one of the staples that I love to do in jazz bands. So that was a fantastic name. Also, that name on a cream ale with coffee and vanilla is like perfect. The beer itself sounds fantastic. I think I've only had maybe 2. I know I've had one cream ale with coffee in it, and I thought it was great. I was so surprised at how good that beer tasted whenever I did it. So yeah, a cream ale with coffee and vanilla sounds fantastic. Sounds like something I may want to brew here coming up pretty soon.
Yeah, it's funny to me because when you think of coffee beers, I think the first place you go is stout and porter, right? I mean, they're dark. You expect coffee to look dark, and so people put coffee in those types of beers. But number 2 is cream ale. In fact, we've got here in California, I've had, maybe not cream ale, but paler yellow beers like Golden Stout, right? I mean, how do you get that roasty character in there? You add coffee to it to kind of trick the brain into thinking you're drinking something more rich and stout-like. It worked out really well in Brian's Jump, Jive, and Whale. Again, I'm not saying my reason for not ordering pint after pint of this is just because I'm not a huge fan of coffee in my beer, but it was one of the better examples of a paler coffee, dosed beer. Really, really quite good. So I appreciate you sending that in, Brian. Very good job. If you'd like to have your beer or any other fermented beverage you feel like sending in reviewed by Jersey and Tim, you can email me, marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we'll get you all set up. All right, we've got to cut to a quick break. When we come back, the focus will be on hot side aeration. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all-grain beer in a single, compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD, that's BRUPOD, at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. There's nothing worse for a brewer than spending hours making wort, letting it ferment a week or longer, then packaging it up and waiting for it to carbonate, only for it to have notable issues. One of the more common being staleness. Like this fresh beer isn't really all that fresh, which many believe can be caused by hot side aeration.
Oh yeah, the dreaded hot side aeration nightmare. I call it a nightmare sort of jokingly because it may actually just be the product of nightmares and not actually based on anything real. But as any nightmare, there are certain things that are grounded in fact, right? We know that oxygen gets into beer, right? Oxygen gets into beer because it's in the air, and it's actually something that the yeast uses during its cell cycle, right? A cell needs oxygen in order to breathe so that it can ferment and make alcohol. So oxygen itself is important, but then we also know that oxygen can lead to oxidation or staling impacts, right? Like staling things, honey flavor, sherry, cardboard, all those nasty sweet flavors, reduced hop aroma, all that stuff that happens at the end. And so everybody, you can imagine, everybody that's trying to make a good drinkable beer is worried about limiting those amount of staling reactions.
Right.
And if you've looked at and you've paid attention to post-packaging, right, or post-fermentation when you're packaging, that's when most oxygen ingress comes in and when those reactions happen most typically. But let's say that you've looked at that and you fixed that and you're still having some oxidation and staling. It makes sense to think about other parts of your process where oxygen may be coming in, and that's where I think people started to look at, well, hey, I'm picking up a lot of oxygen, or potentially picking up a lot of oxygen in my mash tun, or whenever I'm lautering over into the boil. Can that oxygen somehow make it into the finished beer?
Right.
And so that's, so that's the idea. And it turns out a lot of people have looked into this. Even a lot of professional science has been done. obviously we did an experiment on it that we'll get to in the next segment, but there's a lot out there on this topic.
Right. And it's interesting because if somebody's entering the homebrewing world in the last 2 years or so, there is almost no question that they've heard people talk about the dreaded cold side oxidation. This is something that has been shown over and over and over again to have a noticeable, perceptible impact on beer, particularly of the hoppy sort for some whatever reason. That's still an area of focus for a lot of researchers these days. But cold side oxidation has really gotten into the spotlight recently. And personally, I think that has kind of come along with the growing popularity of hazy IPA. It's well known that for whatever reason, again, that style of beer just seems to be more sensitive to cold side oxidation. It wouldn't surprise me if I were to go to a meeting somewhere and a bunch of new brewers had never even heard the term hot side aeration. I don't see it come up almost at all anymore. And in fact, I was talking with somebody a couple of months ago, just on the internet about brewing processes. And they were asking me, about an old photo they saw where I would rack wort from my mash tun into my bucket. And their question was, is it okay that it's splashing around like that? And I was like, whoa, this person actually knows what hot side aeration is all about. It just kind of surprised me because it never comes up anymore, at least in the circles that I'm in. And when we talk about hot side aeration, all we're talking about is any oxygen exposure to the wort when it's hot prior to it being chilled. So that can mean at various points, whether that's the mash or the boil, but pretty much anything after the boil, once that wort's chilled, is what we refer to as cold side oxygenation at the very least. And there's that small little window in there where oxygen is purported to be very, very good for wort. We're not going to get too much into that whole bit of it. But I just want to quote something from perhaps one of the biggest books out there. A good friend of brewlosophy, John Palmer, wrote in How to Brew, "You should not aerate when the wort is hot or even warm. Aeration of hot wort will cause the oxygen to chemically bind to various wort compounds. Over time, these compounds will break down, freeing atomic oxygen back into the beer, where it can oxidize the alcohols and hop compounds, producing off flavors and aromas like wet cardboard and sherry-like flavors."
Yeah, and this is a really good example. So Palmer says that in his book, but unfortunately doesn't point to any study about it. And that's not to say that John is wrong.
Right.
In fact, I think I think he is, and certainly based on the science, he is right that there is a potential impact of getting oxygen in your hot wort that the later binds with some compounds.
Yeah.
But this is sort of an example, like you said. This is a brewing authority who a guy who arguably has done more for homebrewing than. I don't know that I can name even a couple more people that have done more than him.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there is anybody who's done more for homebrewing or to make it more palatable to people like us, right? Than John. And so, but at the same time, and this isn't us calling him out. I mean, John's open to this kind of stuff. We've talked. This isn't anybody who's into science. You're not afraid of people asking questions. I mean, that's why you came to the conclusions that you did, right?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, John. I mean, one of the fantastic things about John is that he bases so much of what he says on science, right? And if you look at hot side aeration, as far as I can tell, sort of looking back through, scientific articles that have been published, it was really only studied back in like the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So it's a relatively recent topic, in terms of brewing, research and science that's happened over the last hundreds of years. But whenever it came out, it was kind of a big deal, right? I mean, you can imagine that somebody looking and going, hey, all this wort is splashing around, and think about like a commercial mash tun that may be like 8 or 10 feet or even 12 feet tall. That's just spraying the wort from the top back down over into a mash tun, or a fly sparge setup at a home brewer. I mean, you're pushing this wort out through these tiny holes and then just spraying it back on the top. Mm-hmm. What if that oxygen's actually getting in? Well, it turns out some people looked into it, and some actually relatively famous brewing scientists did. So I think most people listening to this podcast have heard of Narcissus and Kunze, which are really famous brewing scientists back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And even into the early 2000s a little bit, but I think it was Narcissus that did a study that was really an in-depth study. And what he showed in that, it was back in 1986, and when he showed his oxygen pickup during wort production can actually contribute to staling and oxidation reactions in the finished beer, which is fascinating to think that I'm splashing around my wort. How the hell does it make it from the wort, that's in my mash tun over into my boil kettle, then get boiled for an hour or an hour and a half or an hour and 40 minutes, and then into a fermenter where oxygen is taken up via yeast, then into a package where usually things are re-fermented and still have this oxidative impact. It's amazing that free oxygen can last that long in the brewing process. So if you think about it, it's kind of incredible that this could actually be something that happens. Now, I will say a caveat in that Narcissus study. One thing that I think a lot of people overlook because of the interesting impact of hot side aeration is that he also did in that study packaging pickup post fermentation, meaning at packaging, and he found that was really bad.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, and that's the thing is, so when I think about the conversations that I used to have, 10 years ago, or the forum posts that I would read about people speaking of how terrible hot side aeration is and why it must be avoided, the common descriptors that came along with that, things like wet cardboard, like you mentioned, some stuff that I heard also was like dirty flavors, like the taste of actual dirt, an earthy, dirty characteristic. There's also aldehydes that produce that can get produced again purportedly based on hot side aeration or caused by hot side aeration that taste like candy or an almost almond like sweetness. That those are signs of oxidation caused by hot side aeration. I remember drinking my beers being like, I don't get any of that, and I'm not, it's not like I was intentionally aerating my wort on the hot side, but I certainly wasn't, trying to reduce it to an absolute minimum. And I was producing beers that not only I enjoyed, my friends liked it, they were doing relatively well in competition. So, and that gets into the philosophy of, well, maybe everyone just got used to hot side aerated beers. And that's, and so that's what we've all come to enjoy, which if that's the case, then who cares, right? But still, there was this part of me that was like, but, if I'm not tasting these things, if I'm making a pale ale that tastes like the hops that I put into it and it's clean and we all enjoy it and it doesn't taste like candy and almonds and wet cardboard, then is hot side aeration really having an impact? That was kind of the line of thinking that I always had when it came to this particular brewing concern, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm so glad that you brought that up, right? Because we've got this. Okay, so if we're setting up where we're at right now, we've got a study by a credible scientist who has shown that oxygen can make it through to the finished beer and cause staling issues. But then I, like you and like many other brewers around the world, have splashed our wort, right? Or been a vigorous boil or any of these things that add oxygen, potentially add free oxygen to the hot side. And I've produced really good beer that lasts a while, right? That lasts a long time. Sometimes I've had beer sitting on tap for months and I haven't noticed any staling reactions when I haven't changed anything about my process. Now, maybe my process is just really good for hot side aeration, but I don't think so. I was fly sparging, if anybody's going to get, if any home brewer is going to get oxygen into their beer, people that are fly sparging are probably most likely to do that because you're literally spraying the wort, right? You're spraying the wort back in an oxygen rich environment back into the wort.
Right. During recirculation is what you're talking about.
Yeah. Sorry. During recirculation.
Yeah.
I meant, exactly. And so I think this is really interesting. And one of the points I wanted to say too is that, all right, so we know that this can happen, but how often does it happen, right? And to get to this point, you kind of have to look at, okay, well, what was the science that happened then after that, after we've talked about this, and maybe are there other things that are explaining it? And it turns out, yeah, there can be. For example, there's this pesky little thing called lipoxygenase. It's an enzyme. Most brewers know it as LOX or LOX enzyme. It happens and it happens whenever it exists in malted barley, and it happens whenever you're heating up the wort or the wort or the mash around that 120 F or 50 50 C range, it becomes active, and what it does is it causes that lipoxygenase to become active, free up a whole bunch of oxygen that binds to fatty acids and other compounds that ultimately do negatively affect stability and flavor. Right? So you think, oh, okay, well, that kind of makes sense from a homebrewing perspective. If I'm doing what most homebrewers are doing, which is just a single infusion mash, I'm not doing a step mash. I'm not setting on a mash temperature of 120 for any period of time.
Right.
I'm up at 140, 150 when I'm doing my mash. And supposedly at those temperatures, that's where lipoxygenase will denature. Okay? So it could be a thing that, well, all right, maybe if I'm not doing a step mash, maybe that explains it, right? People were using maybe under modified malt, trying to do that protein rest, and maybe that explains it.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and that was one of the a lot of my memories of talking about hot side aeration came from 8 to 10 years ago, because it really just seems to have kind of fallen off as a thing of concern for at least a lot of the brewers that I talk with these days. But that whole point of, well, maybe it was an actual issue, maybe it's not a myth, as some people think it's fun to refer to it as, for people who are relying on methods that just aren't common these days, right? And that the whole lipoxygenase thing makes sense. If this enzyme is becoming active at what used to be a very common step mash, right, 120 degrees F, but about 50 C, and people are mashing in with 165 degree water so that they hit 152 degree Fahrenheit mash, then you're completely skipping that step, which is going to, and at that temperature, like you said, it's going to denature that enzyme. So you don't really have to worry, at least about that specific thing anymore as being an issue, right? I mean, that seems to make sense to me. And that's a kind of a scientific argument against why, or against the hot side aeration issue, I guess. But there's a lot of other ones as well. How often when you got started brewing, Cade, did you hear that hot side aeration's a myth?
I mean, there was a lot of debate about it, right? I mean, when I got started brewing, people were saying both sides. I mean, there were arguments at homebrew club meetings about whether hot side aeration existed. Yeah,
well, and one of the biggest arguments that I remember was you had the adherents to hot side aeration, the people who were terribly concerned with it, but then those who were calling it a myth, one of their biggest arguments was, well, if it's so bad, then why do we actually promote adding oxygen to the wort prior to pitching the yeast once it's cool? And again, there was always the argument from the adherents to hot side aeration who would say that's because the interactions, the chemical reactions that are occurring that lead to the staling only occur when that wort is hot.
Well, yeah. I mean, so here's a really good example that I was taught in a beginning chemistry class. My professor, and I'll never forget this example. My professor said, "Okay, right, chemistry is, if you think about it, you're looking down at very small molecules, right? So let's take, for example, something that everybody on this podcast consumes, which is carbon dioxide, right? That's a carbon atom and two oxygen atoms bound together, right? CO2. Everyone consumes CO2. We consume it every day, and we breathe it out. It's not toxic, right? But if you take away one oxygen from CO2, suddenly that becomes carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is poisonous and dangerous to humans, right? All we did was take away one oxygen.
Right.
Holy moly, mind blown, right? But I say that as kind of being facetious, but that oxygen serves multiple roles, and it can do different things in different compounds, right? So, but oxygen in its free state binds really easy to things. It reacts really, really well. So it can bind with CO, with a carbon monoxide molecule, and become CO2. Or it can be taken up in yeast, right? And taken up by itself and used as part of the yeast respiration, so that yeast can do its other jobs like ferment and those things. So adding oxygen right before fermentation may serve a different purpose and may not bind with compounds that are existing earlier, right? So if we have oxygen at a hot temperature in the presence of an enzyme, it may bind with a fatty acid that it otherwise wouldn't touch at 60 degrees, what is that in Celsius?
Oh, it's like 15 C, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. at those low temperatures, it may not bind. It may not cause that reaction may not happen. Right before fermentation. So these are things that when you think about it, and when you pull back and actually look at the chemistry, there are ways and times when oxygen is useful, but there can also be ways and times when oxidation is really bad.
Yeah. And for me, it seems like certain things in brewing, and hot side aeration is one of them. There's a lot of, it seems like it could make sense. There's that piece of it. Like from a scientific perspective, we know oxidation happens. I mean, you see it every day. So it makes sense on some level that it could happen to wort as well. So I get that argument. Another argument against hot side aeration that is kind of a quasi argument against it, because it's also arguing for it, is what you'll hear from the whole low oxygen brewing crew, the Loto guys, is that the reason hot side aeration, sensory experiments on hot side aeration seem to show that it doesn't seem to matter, or that people out there anecdotally brewing without a concern for hot side aeration are producing beers that are doing well and tasting good, is because the focus on reducing oxygen exposure already came too late, right? So you've already had the impact, and all of the stuff that you're doing now, whether that's stirring your mash too hard, or boiling and stirring your wort too much, or splashing that wort around, that you're not having any impact because it already all happened, and they start focusing on oxygen exposure as soon as that grain is milled. I mean, they're doing wet milling. They are capping the mash with some form of a solid. A lot of people are using lids, stainless lids, so that no air touches that mash. They're not stirring their mash. They're doing all kinds of stuff to keep oxygen exposure to an absolute minimum, and they'll show in their experimentation. Now, I don't think they do many sensory experiments that I'm aware of, and every time I've asked them to send me a Loto brewed beer, the argument is, well, as soon as we package it and send it to you, it's going to lose all of the magic, and that's fine. But they will show, and I think it's pretty fascinating, color differences in wort made with the same exact grains, water, all of that. One that had this reduced, low dissolved oxygen approach, and the other one that was exposed like a normal beer will. And you, with your two eyes, you can absolutely see a color difference in those worts.
That's interesting, because I've seen this, right? And I see this over and over again, the different color in the wort that comes out, right? So something is happening. Something must be making this color difference that we see whenever we're using and brewing wort, using LODO or low dissolved oxygen methods, versus whenever we're not controlling oxygen or doing, I guess, what I would call more standard brewing practices. I think it's fascinating, and it could be explained by some other things, right? And that's not to discount or say that it's wrong, right? I obviously don't know if it's wrong. There's certainly a visual characteristic. The question now is how do we explain that visual difference? And one of the things I could say is everybody that seems to have brewed using Lodo methods or using that wet wort or, wet grain, then, minimizing oxygen and stuff, seems to have lower efficiency issues. Now, that's the people that I've talked to. I'm not suggesting that happens in every case, and I can certainly stand to be corrected if I'm wrong. But everybody that I've seemed to talk to about this has had lower efficiencies, and to me, that could explain something, right? The difference in sugar content in the two worts will make a color difference.
Yeah. I mean, again, this isn't an episode specifically on methods for focusing on oxygen reduction necessarily, but there's a lot that goes into brewing using that particular method that significantly reduces hot side aeration, and they claim that it really matters, that it produces what they call it. I put that in air quotes. And that it is like a doughy, grainy thing, along with other stuff. I would love to try a beer brewed this way. Again, I don't have the gear to do it properly. And in the one attempt that we've done for an experiment here, we got called out for not doing it exactly as it was prescribed. And so there's that. But I do think it's an interesting approach. If hot side aeration is going to have an impact, I feel like the Loto crew is the one who are going to be able to show it, right? Because of how serious they are. But back to our focus, most people again, historically, in the last 10-ish years or so, their focus is on mash and boil. That you don't want to be too vigorous in your mixing or in your splashing, in your racking at those 2 points, because that's where the fear is. That's where the hot side aeration can have its impact. Now, I think another interesting quote from an authority in brewing, particularly home brewing, Randy Mosier, in Radical Brewing says, hot side aeration has been a bit of a bogeyman of late, with some people going in extreme lengths to prevent it. The question is, will it cause problems in homebrewed beer, especially oxidized flavors as the beer ages? Breweries certainly take it seriously, but then they have a lot more to worry about in terms of product stability. The jury is still out as to whether hot side aeration is injurious to your average batch of homebrew, but I think it's safe to say it isn't a huge problem. A view supported by the fact that the phenomenon wasn't even discovered by brewing science until fairly recently. But it also makes sense to try to avoid techniques that are likely to expose hot wort to an undue amount of air if alternative methods can be found. To me, this is sort of like the Pascal's wager of brewing, you know?
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think Pascal's wager is, especially when it applies to brewing, is a way that I get to be just so incredibly hypocritical that it can sometimes be offensive.
It's true.
I could say like, oh yeah, absolutely need to brew this way, but I don't because of whatever reason.
Yeah.
So I mean, anybody that's not familiar with Pascal's wager, it's if I don't want to go too far into theology, but if you don't look it up, it's a really interesting theoretical construct that Pascal does.
It is a theological theoretical concept, and in essence, we'll put it in the context of hot side aeration. Whether it exists or it doesn't exist, let's pretend like it does and use techniques to avoid it just in case, right? That's the whole argument.
Might as well.
Be mindful of it just in case it actually does matter. If it doesn't matter, you're not losing out on much. I get it. If you are concerned about hot side aeration, whether it's actually there or not, it's, quote, easy enough to avoid that you might be doing the better thing by avoiding it, even if it doesn't really have a perceptible impact on beer. Well, up until I accepted that cold side oxidation was a real issue, but one I only ever experienced with hoppy beers, I can't recall a batch I brewed that had the telltale signs of hot side aeration, that whole wet cardboard thing being probably the most common descriptor I heard. That said, I still did what was prescribed in all of the books I'd read and the forums I frequented by trying to keep hot side aeration to a minimum. Did it matter, or were the efforts I put on that a waste of time? I thought the best thing to do was to test it out to see for myself. Results from the experiment when we're back from this break. The brew in a bag method has blown up over the last few years, and in that time, it's become very clear that not all bags are created equal. For the best BIAB experience, you have got to go with the Brew Bag. Made from high-quality, food-safe polyester, the Brew Bag is available in both 210 micron for standard brew in a bag, as well as 400 micron, which works beautifully for all-in-one recirculating systems. I've been a Brew Bag user for years and wouldn't brew without it. Head over to brewinabag.com to get the fabric filter that works for you, and use promo code TBP17 at checkout to receive a discount. Again, that's brewinabag.com. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Xchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to xchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. Pretty soon after I built out my dual batch experimentation setup, I knew I wanted to test the whole hot side aeration thing, mostly because it was so often talked about at the time. So that's really what inspired this experiment, which I completed almost 7 years ago. Man, one of the first ones that we did at the rollout of Brewlosophy. I think that's kind of fun as well. So what I did is a dual 5-gallon batches of my hop test bitter. That recipe is on the website. I made some changes as homebrewers are wont to do. It's one of my tastier recipes, and it's odd because it works really well as a hop test. That's why it's called that. Even though it's kind of darker and lower OG. Anyways, you can go find it on the website if you want to brew it up. I still like that one. Haven't brewed it in a while, sadly. But this batch consisted of a grist of 80% Maris Otter, 11% Crystal 10, 5% Victory Malt, and 4% Crystal 60. I used the no sparge method on both of these batches, in part because back then that was talked about as producing a maltier beer, which I was after. Both of these were mashed at 152 degrees Fahrenheit or 67 degrees Celsius. And this, of course, was where the variable got started. So for one of the batches, the one that was not going to be hot side aerated, the hot liquor was gently transferred into my converted cooler MLT with a pitcher. I very gently poured it in from the kettle. I didn't want to splash it around at all. So that wort was hot, and there's an argument to be made for heat causing oxygen to dissipate from water and other liquids. You can read about that. So I did that very gently. I milled the grains very gently and stirred them in as well. I did not wet the grains down. I wasn't into that back then. Then I returned twice over the following hour to stir the mash with a plastic spoon as gently as possible. I didn't use my big wire whisk. I didn't want to introduce any oxygen, so I just stirred it real gently, sort of in the way that you might see in a commercial brewery, the way the mash rakes work. So you're just kind of going to the bottom, pulling it, and just to get a little bit of movement in there. So if there is any channeling, if there is any stratification, you're kind of mixing that up a little bit. And also it helps to improve my efficiency. It's something that I do for consistency of efficiency because I don't like to use pumps to recirculate. Another vector for hot side aeration, by the way. For the other batch, the one that was going to be exposed to oxygen, the hot liquor was racked from my kettle to the MLT using a hose, which caused a fair amount of splashing. I very intentionally raised the end of the hose up above the bottom of my mash tun so that it would splash. And then for good measure, I whipped the water with my 24-inch wire whisk before adding the grains. I did that for about 2 minutes, just beat the heck out of it. And then once the grains were added in, I whipped that up like crazy as well. So it was a no holds barred in my mashing in and on that batch. And then over the hour-long mash step, I again returned to vigorously whip the mash at the same intervals that I stirred the non-hot side aerated batch.
Yeah, I bet your arm was sore after vigorously whipping a mash.
There was a lot of whipping going on. We'll put it that way. There's no denying that. And I remember I've never intentionally tried to introduce hot side aeration to a batch. So this was exciting for me. I mean, this was still, I think, 2014. Again, we started in 2014. So this was one of the bigger ones that, back then people were talking about all the time. I was excited to be so, I guess, abusive to a batch of beer in a weird way. So at the end of each mash rest, the non-hot side aerated wort was transferred to a kettle through tubing, where the end of that tube was placed at the bottom of the kettle and was eventually completely submerged in the wort, the purpose being to prevent as much splashing as possible. You still have to get that wort out of the mash tun and into the kettle. And so I couldn't think of a more gentle way of doing that. The other wort was transferred into a bucket, my normal approach, but this time with no tubing. Usually I'd let it run in, either hit the side of the bucket so it would gently fall to the bottom of it. This time I let it splash right into the bucket. There was a bunch of foam. I then poured that wort without concern from the bucket into the kettle, again, with as much vigor as possible without making a mess. And then during the boils, the non-hot side aerated batch was left alone to boil on its own, added hops at all the proper times, while the other wort was whipped up with my whisk a couple of times every 10 minutes for a total of 12 whipping sessions over the hour-long boil. I went nuts on this batch and did everything I could to introduce as much oxygen as possible. In fact, I even tried using a paint stirrer that I attached to the end of my drill. If anyone's ever painted out of a 5-gallon bucket, you know what I'm talking about. It was really messy, but I did it a couple of times just for good measure. And this thing, boy, talk about foam on the top of that kettle, on the top of that wort. So again, I took every measure possible to introduce as much oxygen to that wort as that I possibly could. Now, Cade, in your thinking, if you can go back to when you first started brewing, if you saw somebody brewing using those methods, what would your thoughts be?
Or my first thought would be, what are you doing? Obviously you were trying to get as much oxygen in there as possible. I think most people, when I started brewing, were trying to be gentle with the wort and the beer. Yeah. Right. So I think it wasn't necessarily out of line for people to rack gently from the mash tun over into the bottom of the boil kettle, or let it just kind of cascade down the side of the kettle. Yeah. Kind of whatever your procedure was. But those kind of gentle handling methods, I think, were kind of were normal. What I didn't see anybody doing was sort of whisking a mash, of course, whisking to break up dough balls and make sure you're getting efficiency and extraction, but not to get foam and stuff in there. Yeah. Still, I think even that, whenever I first started brewing, especially, I was, I was reading How to Brew and following John Palmer and Charlie Papazian and, at least with Papazian, relax, don't worry, have a home brew. So I wasn't necessarily I didn't really care how I transferred the wort over to a kettle, right. So, I did the bucket method. I've done that where siphon out of the mash tun into the bucket and then dump the bucket into the kettle. So that's going to get, extra oxygen and stuff in there. Yeah. But I've never, and still haven't ever, gone to the full extent of, closing and sealing my mash tun to make sure that no oxygen and stuff is getting in there, or those kind of similar methods.
When I first made the conversion from extract brewing to all grain, I did various versions of trying to eliminate hot side aeration. One of them was to put foil over the top of the mash and then just leave it alone. Somewhere, I think it was 2012, 2013, I read in some forum that people were getting more consistent efficiency, not just consistent, but also a slight bump up in efficiency when they were using the batch sparge or no sparge method in a cooler MLT, when they would gently stir their mash. So I adopted that practice, but I never whipped it. To me, there's a difference. My typical process prior to this experiment would be fill my cooler mash tun with overheated water, close the lid, let it preheat the mash tun, and I got it down to a science that it would drop right. I would get it to where it would preheat the mash tun and end with strike water right at my strike temperature. And so then I would stir in the grains with my wire whisk. I'd be very gentle about doing it, but I didn't want any dough balls. And then I would just let it sit, and I'd come back and I'd very gently stir it twice throughout the mash rest. And I was very consistently getting about 74 to 75% brewhouse efficiency. In this one, I'd never intentionally beat up a beer the way I had in this one. So I was still, while I'm brewing this one, I'm going, well, if it's going to show a difference, boy, this is the area, this is the time it's going to do it, because I really went to town on this guy. So then both of the worts, once the mashes were complete, like I said, I collected those worts, the sweet wort, in the ways that I described earlier. I boiled both for 60 minutes, and in that 60-minute boil, they received 8 IBU of Falconer's Flight as a first wort hop. My hunch would be that was probably around half of an ounce, 14 grams or so. And then at 20 minutes left in the boil, they got 15 grams of Willamette, It's Willamette, damn it. And then at 10 minutes left in the boil, they got 15 grams of Faulkner's Flight. At 5 minutes left in the boil, they got 21 grams of Faulkner's Flight. And then at flame out, they got 21 grams of Faulkner's Flight for a 10-minute hop stand pre-chilling. After the boil, the worts were chilled quickly with my jaded brewing King Cobra immersion chiller before I took refractometer readings showing that both hit the same OG of 1041. Now, just a note about the chilling process. I had already adopted the whole, move the chiller up and down in the wort process because it's so much quicker than doing that. I did that with both, but for the hot side aeration batch, I did leave it alone until it dropped below about 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And the reason being, the arguments that we discussed earlier is that the hot side aeration reactions that lead to those problems that we talked about occur when that wort is warmer. And so for the hot side aerated batch, I just went to town on it immediately after turning the water on to my immersion chiller, whereas I waited just a little bit for the other batch before I started stirring the wort.
Yeah, so I think this is really interesting. So that you get to a similar OG on both of the beers. Now, this one, again, it bears repeating. This wasn't a test on low oxygen brewing methods, right? This was a test on hot side aeration. So you've arguably added a ton of oxygen, more than the standard brewer or standard home brewer would add into the beer, right? So to see that you hit the same original gravity tells me, okay, that's not necessarily unexpected because, we were stirring the mashes, we're treating them, sort of normally. You're getting the correct efficiencies that you've been normally getting and treating the beers the same. But I wouldn't expect to see a variable. I wouldn't expect to see anything yet, right?
Yeah.
I wouldn't expect to see a change in the beers yet.
Yeah. So yeah, no, I'm with you. And there's, at this point you're going, all right, well, one of them's had all of this aeration. The other one hasn't had nearly as much. The effect is going to come in the packaged beers. So I racked identical volumes of wort from each batch to 6-gallon PET carboys, threw them into my fermentation chamber and let them chill to 64 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 18 degrees Celsius, which took about a couple of hours, at which point I returned and I pitched equal size starters of WLP002 English ale yeast into each one. And then I set the temperatures to 66, this temperature in the chamber to 66 degrees Fahrenheit or 19 degrees C. That's kind of my standard go-to ale fermentation temperature. Now, this is where things started to get really interesting. From a easily observable perspective, there was a difference in fermentation activity just a couple hours post-pitch. Now, these were, active starters that I pitched into these beers, so you'd expect the beers to start up fairly quickly, particularly considering the lower OG, 1041. Later on, about 3 hours, I believe, after pitching the yeast into these beers, the hot side aerated beer seemed to be kicking in a bit more based on Kreuzen, the Kreuzen that was atop the beer at the time. I thought that was really interesting, and it continued for the entire day. The following day, about 16 hours after pitching the yeast, both beers were clearly fermenting. They both had a Kreuzen on the top, but the one that was aerated a ton during the mash and the boil had this interesting dark substance on the top of the Kreuzen. And we've all seen this, but the non-hot side aerated batch, the one that was treated with white gloves, had a much cleaner looking Kreuzen. I thought that was really curious.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think it's hard to explain, right? Like, obviously I don't know what that reason for that difference would be, but it sort of stands to logical sense that you've whipped up and you've got a whole bunch of suspended oxygen, or at least more oxygen in that beer. So a presence of oxygen means the yeast can respirate and breathe and do their thing, have a really fun time, and so that they can kick off very quickly, right? That's why we talk about adding oxygen right before fermentation, so that you give the yeast the best opportunity to be able to do their job. And so you did see the hot side aerated batch pick up really quickly, which is interesting. And now that doesn't explain the dark bits on the top, and I'm not sure that I have a good answer for that, at least right now. But I do see, that's that it's taking off faster. So to me, it seems explained by the variable. So if I'm looking at this at this point, I'm going, oh, wow, maybe there is a whole bunch of oxygen in there, or more oxygen than I expected.
Yeah. So the oxygen thing, what you said was one of the things my friends and I were talking about as this experiment was being fermented, really, because we thought that was just fascinating that it was that happened. I didn't expect it, right? The other one, so one being that just because there's so much more oxygen that it's more active, and that's making this krausen look different. Another one was that oxidative effects change colors. We know that. I mean, you look at cold side oxidized beers versus beers that are treated so that they oxygen exposure is significantly reduced. They look different. The color is different. And so we wondered if perhaps all of that oxygen that was present wasn't having some sort of an oxidative reaction right there during fermentation, causing that krausen to be a different color, to look different, right? So that was another one. The other one, the other argument that a friend of mine made that this one seemed kind of makes sense to me as well. You've all heard, we've all heard the argument that every time a bubble is formed, that's a protein structure that is no longer going to form a bubble later on, right? So if you over whip wort, there was a ton of bubbles coming off of that. So those proteins are no longer capable of forming those bubbles. At least this is what I heard, right? This was the argument that was made, but they're still present in that wort. It's sort of like hot break. If you skim that off, those proteins are no longer present. We left it all there. I stirred this crap up multiple times, created all of these bubbles, all of this foam that just stayed in the wort. So one of the arguments was, well, that's all of those, all the bubble proteins basically that came up to the top and are kind of just not doing much anymore and resting atop the krausen. I really don't know what caused that. We know krausen is largely protein though, right?
Yeah, for sure. It's really hard to say exactly what's going on at this point, right? That, there's so many potential possibilities.
Yeah.
I think it is just really interesting to see that there was an impact in the fermentation, the actual fermentation that happened.
At the very least, it's indicating that these two beers are different, that all of the effort I put into oxidizing or aerating the one batch seems to have caused something different to happen. And I think that's interesting. Well, a few days into fermentation, I ended up raising the temperature. Both were active. I raised the temperature to 72 degrees Fahrenheit or 22 C for a diacetyl rest, really just to encourage both beers to finish fermenting. And then when activity had slowed down and stayed there for a few more days, I took hydrometer measurements that showed the non-hot side aerated batch reached 1011 Fg, while the hot side aerated batch was at 1010 Fg. Typically, that's not something I'm going to concern myself with. Just variability between batches seems to explain that stuff. We've done multiple experiments at this point that show people can't really perceive a 1 point or 2 or even like 6 point difference in finishing gravity. So I wasn't terribly concerned about this, but given the variable, it does seem like perhaps the aerated batch was slightly, perhaps more attenuative.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's interesting as we sort of look back at this, right? To try to figure out. One side is the designing of the experiment, and then the other is looking back and interpreting the results. And as I look through this, I'm sort of looking through this as the lens of going, okay, well, that means maybe the yeast performed better. If there's more oxygen in the beer, the yeast had ample access to oxygen, and so it did its job and just fermented a little bit, slightly better.
Yeah.
It did it faster and a little bit higher attenuation. So, looking at it through that lens, I mean, of course, who knows, right? I mean, and now I'm sort of, that also makes me sort of curious to see, okay, well, all right, wow, maybe there really was more dissolved oxygen in this. So how much of it, stayed through the packaging? So I'd probably be getting pretty excited at this point to see what the results were.
Yeah. There was a lot of things I'm looking at going, holy moly, I think we've done it. We're going to show again, my whole motive in starting the experiment project and Brewlosophy was to show why we're not supposed to do these things. Again, it kind of went the opposite direction of that, but this was one of those experiences in the beginning for me where I'm going, here it is. This is why we don't do it. So I ended up cold crashing those beers for a couple of days, and they were racked to sanitized kegs. Back then, I hadn't even heard the term cold side oxidation, and so I was racking these into kegs that were open on the top, but I did it as gently as possible. After a week, the beers were carbonated and ready for evaluation. They were placed in my key teaser on gas. So objectively, right next to each other, to my eyes, these beers looked identical. They had a nice amber hue to them. Neither was darker or lighter than the other. Neither had that purple thing that you see in cold side oxidation. They just looked the same to me.
Yeah, they look really good. I mean, I'm looking at the pictures on the website right now. I mean, they're reasonably clear, nice golden amber color. I mean, it looks really nice.
Yeah, everything about them was visibly at least the same. And then as we often do, as we always do, in fact, I started doing my own series of evaluations on these beers before I served them to blind tasters. And in my experience, knowing everything that I'd done to these beers, they tasted, smelled, felt in my mouth exactly the same. There was nothing about them that was different. And on top of that, I didn't detect any of the classically discussed signs of oxidation or staleness. Again, maybe that's just my palate. I remember the beers not being totally great. I realized I'm not a huge fan of Faulkner's Flight, but they were good. They were good. I didn't dump the batches. My friends drank the beer. My subjective preference wasn't necessarily for that particular hop variety, but there was nothing glaringly wrong about either of these beers. And again, they just tasted identical to me.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of fascinating. They look identical, and apparently they taste they taste the same. So I mean, it's time to put it to tasters.
Yep, that's right. And back then we weren't doing our minimum of 20 tasters, so I was able to get 12 of my brewing buddies. I'm pretty sure I took this one to a homebrew club meeting, out of which 8 would have needed to identify the odd beer out in order for us to say with some element of confidence that these beers did have a difference that couldn't be explained by random guessing. In the end, just 4 of those 12 people were able to identify the unique sample in a triangle test. That's exactly 33.3%, which when you're served 3 identical things, you would expect from people randomly guessing. You would expect, 1/3 to pick each of the colors. And that is exactly what happened in this experiment. People could not tell these beers apart. And in conversations afterwards, they were saying they thought they were tasting the same exact beers. And that, to me, again, all this does is it shows us that using the methods that I did with my understanding of what hot side aeration was and what people were actively avoiding back then, as much as I tried to impart the negative characteristics that hot side aeration is said to impart, it didn't seem to work.
Yeah, and see, this is just such a good example about what I love about this beverage and the science behind it is because, we see what we've seen in terms of the fermentation kicking off faster. We saw a little bit higher attenuation, so at this point we're thinking, all right, if I'm testing oxygen in the beer, we're thinking, hey, there's oxygen in this that's causing these things, or maybe that's an explanation. And then you serve it to tasters and there's no perceptible difference.
Yeah.
At least from a sensory perspective. Now, again, no objective data taken here, but again, maybe the beers were different and there were some objective differences. But in the sensory context that this beer was tasted, there was no difference, which is just shocking to me. And I love it. It makes me, want to dig deeper and try to understand, okay, well, what was going on? Well, what explained this? Did the yeast take up all of the additional oxygen? That's why it, kicked off a little bit faster and then, attenuated a little quicker. So it ate up all that oxygen, even though you whipped the crap out of the mash and the boil. The yeast still consumed all of the oxygen that was there.
Yeah.
Or, maybe that oxygen just didn't react yet. Maybe that needed more time. It needed 6 months in a keg or something.
Yeah.
All of these sort of fascinating things is just why I love the science of this and why I love this beverage.
Yeah. Yeah. No, all of these thoughts that you talked about went through my mind as well. And I think one of the more interesting implications of these findings at the time, again, this was mid to late 2014, I believe. Brew in a Bag was just starting to, it was already out there, but it was just starting to catch fire here in the US and people had been talking real bad about it. I mean, I'll be honest, there was kind of this, nose up perspective of these crazy Australians who came up with this idea of lautering using a fabric filter. I mean, nowadays it's so popular. And I think a part of it is people not being so concerned about things like hot side aeration, this bogeyman, as Randy Mosher refers to it as, because when you're using the brew in a bag approach, which I use exclusively these days, you're lifting that bag out, you're letting that wort drip back into your kettle on top of all the wort that's already there through holes that are making those droplets very small and easily accessible to oxygen. If there's going to be an issue with hot side aeration, us BIA beers are going to notice it probably more than anyone else. And I just haven't till this day. I still use the brew in a bag method. I still stir my mash regularly. I stopped worrying about being terribly gentle with it. Right after this experiment, once these results came back, I stopped worrying about, my transferring from the MLT into a bucket and then into the kettle. It was kind of a confirming thing for me, even though I expected the results to be different than they were.
Right. It's so funny. We talked at the top of the show when we were talking about Narcissus and his research. We talked about how, okay, we know that oxygen can make it through into the packaged beer and contribute to staling, but it's just not consistent with what our experiences were, right? I mean, it wasn't consistent with the taste that we were getting or being able to taste that. Now, I know what oxygenation and oxidation impact tastes like. I've been trained on it. I've done a bunch of tasting panels. I know what to expect and I know what to taste. I don't treat my wort specifically, and I know that in my experience brewing my beers, I don't have shelf stability issues, right. At least like that, right? I mean, now that could also be just because I'm consuming most of the beer before, before months and months and months go by.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if I don't have to be super cautious about how I'm treating my wort or how much oxygen is getting into the boil and all that stuff, then that's a great thing for me, right? It helps me feel comfortable in what I'm doing. And another thought that sort of just occurred to me, is, hey, we're always worried about oxygen and getting oxygen and worrying about the fermentation and making sure that it's fully attenuating and the yeast have everything that they do. It seems like in this beer, if you want to get more oxygen in, maybe just whip that mash up and whip that boil up and go and see what it does.
Yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong. We got a lot of comments. We're going to get to some here on this experiment, but a lot of them were those people who, confirmation bias, we all engage in it, but who were saying, see, this proves that hot side aeration doesn't matter. It can be, maybe it's even good for your wort or your beer. I'm not going to jump to that conclusion based on this finding. I will say that when you add these results to my own anecdotal experience, it's certainly not something that I'm concerned about anymore. Now, that doesn't strip the arguments that we're still starting our focus far too late for it to matter. Maybe that is the case, but that's for another experiment. As it is based on this is how people were talking about hot side aeration, was in the mash and in the boil. And I went to the nth degree to create a hot side aerated bad batch of beer, and it just didn't happen. I think that's really fascinating. So first comment that we got comes from Dave Watson, who says, very interesting. I'm most interested that the aeration of the hot side aeration beer seems to have carried over after chilling to some degree, possibly leading to a quicker start to fermentation. This is something you've been hitting on a little bit too, Cade. And that is kind of interesting that when we talk about the boil, it's widely believed that drives off a lot of oxygen, which is why people add pure oxygen to their chilled wort, is to get some of that oxygen back in there for the as a yeast nutrient.
Yeah, exactly. Dave was obviously thinking about the same things that I was thinking about whenever I was looking through this. Yeah, so you've got that additional oxygen, that made it into the boil, that made it into the fermenter, that lasted all the way through the boil, which I think that's great. It's hard to say that was what caused the fermentation to start faster. I mean, of course, there are always other variables. You never know for sure, but it certainly seems to stand to reason, or at least what we know, or at least what we think happens. That this really did lead to that fermentation kicking off faster.
I mean, I treated these beers as identically as possible outside of the whipping, and it was easily observed that the HSA beer started before the non-HSA beer, and so I think it's because of that. But people can choose to believe what they want. So, all right, next comment comes from Keith Kirchhoff, who says, I've often discussed this amongst friends, and I've personally never noticed a difference. Admittedly, I most often introduce a bit of HSA since I usually pour from one vessel to the next. I really appreciate hearing of your results.
Yeah, discussing this with the friends, I still remember. I mean, I know several of the brewers. I can still picture their faces that have told me that you've got to worry and you've got to be careful with all that stuff. You can't don't overstir the mash. I know you're interested in efficiency and all that, but don't overstir it. You're just introducing a vector for oxidation.
Yep.
And it's just it's really funny. Like I said, I used to pour from the mash tun into a bucket and then transfer from that bucket to the boil kettle and then sometimes dump the boil kettle into the fermenter too.
Yeah.
So there have been times in my brewing history where I wasn't as gentle with the beer as I would say that I am now. But like you say now, I mean, I brew on an electric brew in a basket system. So I've got a basket that'll lift up and that wort just drips out of the bottom. So, it's got to be picking up oxygen and I'm not noticing those negative effects that are supposedly purported with hot side aeration.
Yep. I'm right there with you. Robert Jalloway commented, if anything, it seems like HSA is a positive thing. You had a much more rapid onset of fermentation and a slightly lower final gravity. I'd be interested in seeing if that replicates. To Robert, again, I don't like to take these results as being that extreme, as meaning that much that it's positive. I do think it's interesting, those easily observable differences in fermentation and in attenuation. Yes, absolutely interesting. I'd be curious to see if it replicates. I just don't think anyone is going to. It's more work to invest that much time into aerating the mash and the wort during the boil. It's easier just to stop worrying about it, but not invest so much effort in doing that,
Right. And I would say that's the key, right? The replication of this would be really the key before I'd feel like you more comfortable with saying that this is a positive thing or even a negative thing. Replication so that you can do it a bunch of times and see what comes out.
Exactly. All right, final comment comes from Mario, who says, thinking back when I was a total newbie and on my first brew, I used the splash method with the wort chiller thinking it would cool the wort faster, which it did. I guess for the small amount of time homebrew lasts on the shelf, hot side aeration probably doesn't apply. The beer came out okay. I now choose to not aerate as much as possible above 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So here's the thing. A lot of people will talk about shelf stability, and it's... I'm with other people in homebrewing who wonder why that's such a huge concern for homebrewers. Because first off, we're making relatively small batches that, second off, we drink relatively quickly. If you are the type who bottles these beers and puts them on the shelf for a long time, maybe hot side aeration has some impact over time. But I mean, again, this is in all practicalness. I just don't think that's a huge concern for most people making beer at home. On the commercial scale, of course, I think it'd be fascinating to compare hot side aeration, against a batch that is treated much more gently in terms of aeration. But even then, I don't. If you're boiling it and then fermenting it, my hunch is from what I understand about brewing science, most of that oxygen is going to be taken up and not negatively impact or even have much of an impact at all on the finished product that you're producing. Rather, cold side oxidation becomes the bigger concern once that wort is fermented.
Right. I mean, this is where we get again into Pascal's dilemma. Yeah, if you can reduce the risk, shouldn't you? And who knows? I mean, I'm not going to say one way or the other for anybody on that, but I will say that if beer is lacking stability issues on the shelf from a homebrew perspective, first place I'm going to look is at packaging. Is oxygen getting into the bottle, or is there oxygen ingress through the cap into the bottle? I mean, those are the first places I'm going to look, because those are, like you said, those are so much stronger and happen so much more often than I would think hot side aeration does. Now, that doesn't mean that hot side aeration isn't having an impact. Again, it's just, it wouldn't be the first place that I look. And again, I'm not out there whipping my mash every time that I mash just to get as much oxygen as possible into it. But I'm also, not taking particular precautions. I'm not sealing my mash tun or spraying my wet grain, and I think this obviously lended itself to one of the reasons why Jake did some of the Lodo brewing experiments, which are probably subject for future episodes.
Absolutely. I actually have a story recently, just last week. A buddy, a real good buddy of mine who started homebrewing a few years ago, made a Kolsch and wanted me to give it a try. I love Kolsch. I know you do too, Cade. And he brought it over and he poured it off of his keg into a growler, brought it over. We socially distanced, shared this thing, and it. I poured it. It smelled phenomenal. It smelled like good noble hops. Nice. You could smell that Pilsner malt in there, and it also had a slight, just very, very tinge of purple to it. And it had a very subtle, growing, I'm assuming, but a very subtle candy-like sweetness to it. My first thought wasn't hot side aeration. My first thought was, I asked him, how did you package this beer? And he kind of shook his head and he's like, yep, I racked it into an open keg that wasn't purged. And next time I'm going to be more mindful of that. That is exactly where my mind goes. I'm not worried so much about hot side aeration. Does that mean it's a myth? Well, I don't think so. I think on a scientific level, under a microscope, if you will, that hot side aeration may very well have some sort of a measurable impact. But I don't, or better said, we have not been able to show that it has a perceptible impact. And that, again, is based on the way that we've approached hot side aeration, not necessarily speaking to other more stringent approaches to reducing hot side aeration. Well, that is all we've got for this episode on HSA. I'm actually shocked we haven't covered it before now, and I'm glad we finally did get around to it. Cade, do you have anything else before we wrap things up?
No, this was a fun one, and it's something I'm interested in thinking more about. So if you've got feedback or want to send a question or just something that you heard in this episode, go ahead and email me.
Yep, and don't forget you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brewlosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.